Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Midweek in the City. This is week three, I guess. Okay, that's good. I'm so glad that we can have these events, even though it's I was going to say a little different. It's quite a lot different than we've been used to.
Yeah.
But here we are, nonetheless. And most importantly, here you are. So that's pretty wonderful.
Yeah.
Our guest this evening is Roger Olson. He is professor at Truett Seminary, and he has been our guest before. He's become really a friend of FBCSA, and so we're glad to welcome him aboard to this edition of Midweek in the City, in which we will be talking about the existence of God, arguments for the existence of God, the reliability of the kind of universe that says that God does exist. All those kinds of things. And I'm hoping that we will bring it down to a very usable kind of thinking for the everyday. And joining, as always, on our panel is Megan Langen, Associate Minister for Single Adults here at
I'll be asking the questions,
FBCSA.
not answering them.
She'll be,
I'm not equipped.
Right. She and I will both be asking the fount of knowledge this evening, Dr. Roger Olson. So, Dr. Olson, welcome. I'm glad you're with us.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
I'm very glad. Dr. Olson, I might add, is in Waco right now, and so he's with us from long distance. So, Dr. Olson, let's just get underway here with this first question, diving in. There's a kind of thinking that believes that knowledge is accessible only through what we can see, only through material means, empirical results, and therefore we can't even attain knowledge about the spiritual realm. Is that, help us to understand knowledge here, the concept of knowledge. Is that a proper understanding of knowledge? In other words, does knowledge rule out faith? If you're aiming for knowledge, does that rule out faith?
I'm glad you asked it that way. The way that it was sent to me was, does faith rule out knowledge?
Yeah, and that was my mistake, actually. So
yeah, so they're both valid questions, but I prefer to answer, does knowledge rule out faith? Because I think that's what people struggle with.
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't mean at all to be mean about it, but I think that we are brainwashed by modernity coming out of the Enlightenment to think that the word knowledge should only apply to things that can be proven with empirical means, such as science and so forth. I mean, I see this in popular culture, on television all the time. The Big Bang Theory, for example, to name one TV show that kind of promotes that idea. But I think that's a real unnecessary and even unhelpful restriction of knowledge. There are many things, such as ethics, for example, just to pick one thing that's not specifically Christian or even religious, but people who believe that there is such a thing as right and wrong, but can't prove by empirical means what is right and what is wrong.
Right, you can't take a piece of litmus paper and test for rightness or wrongness.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's really a modern prejudice that's been sent down to us through the ages, through mainly education, but also through culture generally, and now in popular culture, that the word knowledge should be restricted to what can be proven. But, in postmodernity, which is the culture we're entering into now, that nobody completely agrees what it is, but one thing it definitely is throwing that idea out. And almost all postmodern philosophers disagree with that idea of knowledge and are arguing that it was a modern prejudice and that we need to be open to more ways of knowing than modernity gives us, that science is not the only way to answers about big questions and important questions. So I would disagree I think there's even an element of faith in all knowing, because there really isn't very much that can be proven. Maybe in mathematics and chemistry, but not in the big issues of life that really matter.
You know, if I may follow up here, a couple of things. One, what you just said, I think sometimes has a tendency to scare some people who say, well, you're just calling for the dismantling of science, and so anybody can put out a shingle and say, I have some knowledge and you ought to come get surgery here and we'll just see how it goes. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, not at all. It's not a dismantling of science, but it's putting science in its place.
Okay, yeah.
The science is limited in what it can say. It can't make statements such as Carl Sagan made at the beginning of the famous Cosmos series that he did some decades ago. I know there's a new series, but he stood there on a rocky outcropping looking over the waves of the ocean and said, the cosmos is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. But the problem is that's not a scientific statement. Science can't prove that. That's a philosophical statement.
It is.
But he made the statement as if he were speaking as a scientist, but he wasn't. He was speaking as a philosopher at that moment.
That's a great point. And
there's a lot of confusion about science.
There is. And my second thing, and I'll be quiet so that Megan can get a word in here, but even Einstein, although he did work out mathematical proofs, when he was conceiving his idea of how the universe was put together, especially how it was shaped by gravity, these were thought experiments. These were concepts that he thought were so elegant that they must be true. And I'm not trying to throw him, out of the scientific community. I'm simply saying that insight is not empiricism. So,
something that most people don't know is that many scientists have believed in God. Isaac Newton was a strong believer in God. And he thought that discovering the laws of nature was thinking God's thoughts after him.
Yes.
Einstein believed in God. He said God does not play dice with the universe. But he wasn't throwing out God. He didn't really think we could know much about God. He thought he was kind of agnostic. But let's look at Francis Collins.
Yeah.
If you're watching TV, you know Francis Collins is one of the leading scientists in the world. He was the leader of the Genome Project.
That's right.
Yeah.
Discoverer of the genetic code that makes us up. And he's the head of the National Institutes of Health. And he is a strong evangelical Christian. So this idea that you can't be both a strong Christian and a scientist is just not true.
That's right.
So let me throw out a couple names because we can't answer every question here. People need to go to YouTube and look up these names. John Lennox, Lennox, a scientist and mathematician at Cambridge, who is, I think, the most articulate defender of belief in God as a scientist. John Polkinghorne, I can't spell the name right now, but just sound it out. It's really easy to find. And many others. Ard Louis, Louis, is at England, a experimental and theoretical physicist who is a strong Christian and apologist for belief in God. So, these people tend to be British for some reason. America, we have been taught for some reason in our public school system and elsewhere that science and faith are in conflict with each other, but they just are not.
Right. It's an artificial conflict, I think.
Very much.
Yeah, and you spoke to this a little bit, but I think we're often taught that spiritual arguments are inherently weaker than material arguments, and it does seem like there's been kind of an upshot in this thinking. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on what arguments we're talking about. If we're talking about chemistry, for example, then there's no place for spiritual arguments in chemistry. If you're talking about ethics, though, well, there are no material arguments really that add up to anything like an absolute. Have to go with, if not spiritual arguments, at least something non-material to come up with ethics. So I think it depends on the realm or sphere of knowledge that we're talking about, which is better, material or spiritual arguments.
Right.
Yeah, I think when they don't stay in their lane and try and attempt to jump lanes and become a philosopher sounding like, or a scientist would attempt to do philosophy in defense of materialism, for instance, that's using that's sending mixed messages for sure,
Yeah.
I think. Anything else to add there?
Yeah,
About,
no, I think that's insightful, because when we're thinking about the existence of God, we tend to fall into one of those two camps. We're talking about material arguments versus spiritual arguments, and it's not such a dichotomy, it sounds like. So I think that's a helpful way to understand that.
But when it comes to God, I think both material and spiritual arguments are helpful.
Yeah,
I think material arguments can be used to point to God,
yeah,
as well as spiritual arguments. So there, I think the two can go hand in hand and complement each other.
yeah.
I would like to talk a little bit about the concept of atheism, Dr. Olson. An enlightened modern perspective, or have atheists always been with us? And how new are these arguments that atheists might raise against the existence of God?
Well, that's kind of a historical question, and it's hard to know. Now, as far as public arguments against the existence of God, you can really only go back to the late 1700s, and even then, people like David Hume in Scotland were very coy about it because there were laws in almost all countries against atheism.
Yeah.
Okay.
So until the 1800s, if you were an atheist, you had to be extremely cautious. I personally think David Hume, the Scottish philosopher who died in 1776, was an atheist, but he could not say so. He had to write his books as dialogues, and there was an atheist in some of his dialogues, but he could always say, well, that's not me. I'm just writing a dialogue. So the first atheist that was very public about it was Ludwig Feuerbach, a German philosopher in the early part of the 1800s. I can't remember the exact dates, but he felt free, and apparently was, in Germany at his time, to openly say there is no God. God is a projection of the human need for there to be a God, and we project this need up into heaven and claim that there is a God, when it's really just a projection of our need for there to be a God. And of course, Freud followed on that and said it's a projection of our need for a perfect father. So I think the beginnings of modern atheism are really in the early 1800s, but there have always been atheists around. They've just been very cautious about it. And so we don't know exactly. We can't name atheists.
Yeah.
Back in ancient Greece or Rome, perhaps.
Is that why, or let me ask it this way, why then do we have historical arguments for God's existence from a philosophy standpoint? Who were they presenting these arguments to? What was going on there?
That's a great question. So we begin to really see rational arguments for the existence of God popping up in the early decades and early centuries of the last millennium. So with someone like Anselm of Canterbury, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, part of the Norman conquest of England, he developed what's called the ontological argument for the existence of God. And he said that he was simply trying to answer, why does the Bible say the fool says in his heart there is no God? Well, it's not as if there were atheists running around that he had to answer. He was simply trying to show that belief in God is rational and not just a leap of faith.
Okay.
But I suspect he must have foreseen the coming of atheism, as well as Thomas Aquinas a little bit later, 150 years later after Anselm, a great Catholic thinker who, he wasn't really answering atheists, but he was trying to show Christians and Muslims that belief in God is reasonable and not just a leap of faith.
I guess people are practical. You alluded to the scriptures saying that the fool says in his heart there is no God. While there were not perhaps people going around trumpeting their atheism like Richard Dawkins, we have today. Yeah. Practical atheism has been around with us always. People behaving as if there are no there's no moral gravity in the universe.
Yeah.
And so I guess you have scriptures like this saying, the fool says in his heart there is no God.
Yeah.
So all the arguments, or I would prefer to say reasons rather than arguments, since
Okay.
argument sounds bad to us, but let's say reasons for
Reasons.
believing in God go actually back to Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher.
Huh.
And I don't think there were any atheists that he was trying to refute. I think he was just trying to show that belief in God, or what he believed God is rational. Now, of course, in recent years, and especially since the rise of open atheism 150, 200 years ago, these arguments or reasons have come into play in a new and special way.
Very good. Very good.
And could you talk to us a little bit about Aquinas' 5 ways, about the understanding of God or the existence of God, or some of the other better-known
5
arguments?
ways, and
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we're jumping over several things, and it's hard to jump. It's hard for me to jump right into the reasons or arguments for believing in God without saying a little bit more about why they matter.
Well, please, go right ahead.
So I think that there really are very few people who come to true faith in God based on a rational argument for the existence of God. So what is their purpose? Why do we even use them? Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is to refute the claims of atheists and show that their arguments that belief in God is irrational are not true. And so thus, in that way, to remove a stumbling block that non-Christians often have.
Okay, yeah.
And show that, no, belief in God is not irrational. Now, these would be people, in my opinion, who are already wanting to believe in God, but somehow have been confused by these arguments of the new atheists and others. And so I think the arguments for the existence of God or reasons can be very helpful with them in removing those false stumbling blocks that have been put in their way. Secondly, I think there are many Christians, probably some in this audience, who have come to wonder, is belief in God reasonable, or is it just a blind leap of faith that really has no rationality to it? Is it intellectually responsible to believe in God?
Yeah.
So let me just say that even if I weren't a Christian, I would believe in God for philosophical reasons. I'll just throw that out there and
so
let people do with it whatever they want to.
That's quite a statement.
Yeah.
Even
But
if you weren't a Christian, you would believe in God for philosophical reasons. That's
right, but the God I would believe in would be a deistic God rather than the Christian God.
Okay.
God who is the creator but not involved and doesn't really care about me personally and so forth. But I would have to believe in God as a necessary, omnipotent being to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing?
Okay.
I mean, that's the most basic philosophical question of all. And I doubt that most people sit around thinking about it a lot, but it probably occurs to a lot of people from time to time, and they should ask themselves, why does this universe exist? You know, and scientists even talk about the edges of the universe and how many galaxies there are. Well, what's beyond all that, you know? And where did it all start? And so that's where Thomas Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God come in. And there were 5, but they've been really updated over the years. I don't think that any of them really can be used in exactly the way Thomas Aquinas gave them back in, I think it was the 13th century.
And is that because the world has changed or our sensibilities have changed? Why?
Yeah,
why?
very much.
Okay.
Our language has changed. The way we look at the words that he used would just not make much sense to most people today, but they're easily translated. So the first 3 of Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways I can summarize as simply that the universe doesn't explain itself. And if we look around at the universe, there are questions that arise out of the universe about its beginnings. There has to have been a first cause who is not part of the universe itself, because no part of the universe actually is necessary. It's all contingent. It might as well not be as be. So he argued that there has to be a necessary being, and that necessary being has to be omnipotent, and that being has to be something like the God of the Bible, or at least an omnipotent personal being with purpose to get the thing going and to sustain it and to give it order, because the universe displays fine-tuning, what is called divine intelligent theory today, but has been so beaten up by so many academics, but I still use the term. The universe displays order. And, they teach us, if we look at science, that if things were just a slightly bit different, temperature-wise, life on Earth would not be possible. So there seems to be design in nature and in ourselves. So those are the first of the three ways. First cause, argument from contingency to necessity, and argument from design. Then there's a fourth cause that I've never understood, so I'm going to skip it. And the fifth cause is the most important one. The fifth cause is the one that actually works. And that is that without God or something like God, a moral governor of the universe who is goodness itself, there cannot be moral, ethical absolutes. And without God, morality would ultimately be subjective. It would just be a construction of society, which we know can change all the time, or subjective, just personal preference. And I think the best expression of that, though it's a very, very big book, is Catholic theologian Hans Kung's book, Does God Exist? And of course, just looking at it is going to intimidate a lot of people. So there's a lot of things on the internet, on YouTube, that explain it. And I've done it on my blog just recently, arguing that based on the movie that's come out recently called Godless, not the series. I'm not talking about the series that's a pseudo-Western, but I'm talking about a movie called Godless. You can find it on Prime Video. It's about two brothers who are in love with each other and have sex with each other. And it ends up with one of them walking away because, as the author says, who is an atheist, says, propriety wins, but at what cost? And the implication is, if there is no God, what's wrong with this?
Yeah.
Business. And without God, nothing is really objectively wrong, except that people say so. But that doesn't make it wrong. So if there are absolutes in ethics, there has to be a God.
Well, and that, just to hear you say it like that is rather frightening. I mean,
It ought to be.
It puts us in if that's the kind of universe we live in, that's not a very safe place to live.
Yeah, and it's not only me and evangelical Christians who say this. Immanuel Kant was perhaps the most influential philosopher of the Enlightenment, and he strongly argued that belief in God is necessary for objective ethics and morality.
I see.
That's been kind of forgotten. We now kind of think, oh, ethics, morality, social construction, people make it up. But just think of the implications of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about you personally? What is the reason for God that most resonates with you? Is it that final way of...
Well, it would be two things. One is, even if I weren't a Christian, I would not know how to explain why there's something rather than nothing. I would have to look at the universe and say there has to be a creator. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be the God of the Bible. It could be conceived in different ways. Aristotle called it the unmoved mover. Different philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who is probably not a Christian, though that's debatable, thought of God as, the governor of the universe, the one who rewards and punishes good, evil behaviors and so forth. So for those two reasons, I think that there's no other explanation for there being a universe that we live in, and the other, that there's really no other explanation for objective morality, for right and wrong.
Got it.
Yeah. And
To me, those work.
Yeah. And this turns the corner a little bit, but what do these arguments, or reasons rather, for God's existence, what do they tell us about things like the sovereignty of God? And then similarly, what do they tell us about the authority of Scripture, that we can trust those things?
Nothing.
Okay.
See, that's very interesting
Yeah.
because you alluded to that when you said it may not be the God of the Bible that, these reasons end up with. So how do we get there?
Yeah. Well, that's a whole other discussion, isn't it? So even if I weren't a Christian, I might wonder, I hope I would, this God, this creator of the universe, has he ever revealed himself? What is he like, or what is it like? I would look around and see if there's any revelation of that God. But ultimately, to accept something like the Bible as the revelation of God does require faith, experience, and does ultimately arise from reading it and hearing the voice of God in it. But that's not something that can be proven. There are evidences and reasons, but they don't amount to proof, I don't think. So that's where faith really does come in. But I don't think of faith as a subjective leap into the dark. I think of faith more as an experience, or something that arises out of an experience of encountering God or being encountered by God.
Yes.
And without that, I don't think there really can be a personal relationship with God. But I do believe as a Christian that God is reaching out to us and asking us to receive his revelation. And we either do or we don't. And I think most people who don't do it because they're deaf to it. And why are they deaf to it? Because they don't want. I know I'm treading on thin ice here. That makes more sense in Minnesota than in Texas. You have to live in Minnesota to know what thin ice means and why it's dangerous. I tell my students that at the beginning of every fall, so in October, every news TV station in Minnesota has a story every year of the first pickup truck that went through the ice, because people have their pickup trucks out onto the lakes to do ice fishing. And every year, someone goes out too soon. And you see this pickup truck going down into the water through the ice. And that's a warning to people. It's not ready yet. Don't do it. So that's where that phrase, don't go out on thin ice, comes from. And I'm going out on thin ice, I know when I say this, but I think a lot of people who don't believe in God and who don't believe in revelation, that God is revealing himself to us through Jesus Christ, just don't want to be accountable. God. They want to be the God of their own life. And so they've deafened themselves, just turned a deaf ear to God. And I think God is speaking to us, and we just don't want to hear it because we don't want to obey.
Yeah, Revelation really is a community project, isn't it? I mean, it's not just God blasting something out. It has to land somewhere on a person who is in a posture to receive it.
Yes.
Or else it's just not going to be received. It's a two-way thing. And whenever you have persons, I guess this is how life together works. You mentioned the whole leap into the abyss of faith. I remember hearing Dallas Willard say a few years ago that what we call a leap of faith today really people use it colloquially as if it's just a leap into the abyss. But what really Kierkegaard and some others have meant was a leap to faith, not just a leap into a the blind maw of the abyss, but a leap to a faith that helps us to get somewhere.
Yeah, and for many people, it isn't a leap, it's a step.
Good point. Great point.
Yeah.
It's just a step from beyond philosophy into revelation. And I think the two can really go hand in hand. And I know Dallas Willard agreed with that. But thank you for pronouncing Kierkegaard's name correctly. I'm half Danish. And
my son taught me how to do that. So
yeah. People always pronounce it wrong as Kierkegaard, but in Danish, we don't pronounce the D, and the AAR is or, so it's Kierkegaard.
I'm so glad I got that. I passed
you
that.
An A.
Passed
you
that benchmark.
That.
Thank you. I'll take it. Really.
No, I think that's incredibly helpful, because we talked a little bit about this last week at Midweek in the City of, at some point, where does the leap of faith or the that jump come in? But I think that helps kind of tone that back to, no, these
Yeah.
are steps of faith, and they're not blind, like you said, jumping into the abyss. Yeah, I think that's a super helpful framework to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think I did this. I think I helped us to skip over any mention of Anselm as far as his argument or his reason for the existence of God.
I was just sitting here thinking that we skipped that.
Could we backtrack a little bit?
His ontological argument for the existence of God, I think, actually works. It's a proof of the existence of God, but it's so abstract.
It is.
That people just brush it aside as irrelevant to anything.
I've had people say to me, "What?" when I try to, and I don't explain it very well. So help us there.
So Anselm said, think with me about God and listen to this definition of God and hold it in your mind. The being greater than which none can be conceived. So now if you have that thought in your mind, think about whether that being exists or not. And if you say, I can conceive of a being greater than which none can be conceived, but I conceive of it as not existing, you've just contradicted yourself. Because to exist in reality is greater than to exist only in the mind. So when you think the thought, being greater than which none can be conceived, you have to be thinking of it as existing.
Because existence is greater than conception.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, I think it was a brilliant, brilliant move. There have been critics of it, of course, over the centuries, including a monk in his own time who wrote an essay called On Behalf of the Fool, arguing that that argument doesn't work, but I don't think he succeeded in showing it doesn't work. I think it does work, but only logically. In other words, it really has trouble connecting with our heart or anything like that. And most people who hear it go, okay, it works, I guess, as a logical syllogism.
That's kind of how they that's kind of how they respond when I've said that. But if I may take a little bit of crass liberty here with Anselm's argument or reason, let me give a more of a modern day rough analogy, and you tell me, Dr. Olson, if this is in any way some way to provide a handle for some people. If I read a comic book about Batman, and I think that is the coolest comic book character in the world, which I happen to do believe that, then any Batman who actually exists in the real world would be greater than the Batman in the pages of this comic book by virtue of actually existing in the real world. That would
yes,
be, by
that's
definition,
what Anselm
greater.
was saying.
Okay.
To exist in reality is greater than to exist in the mind or imagination.
Okay.
So one of the arguments that's been used in favor of that is, and I've done this with my students, I'll have two $1 bills in my billfold, and I'll pull out my billfold, and I'm sorry, one $1 bill. I'll pull out the $1 bill and then hold in my hand an empty, open hand. I'll say, now this is an imaginary dollar bill. It only exists in my mind, and this is a real dollar bill that actually exists. Which is greater?
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
And they always pick the one that actually exists. And I say, well, that shows that you believe it's greater to exist in reality than to exist only as a thought in the mind or imagination.
Okay.
And so a being greater than which none can be conceived has to be conceived of as existing, or else you're not yet thinking of the being greater than which none can be conceived.
Okay.
So think again, the being greater than which none can be conceived. Oh, it has to be conceived as existing to be the being greater than which none can be conceived.
Okay.
Now, it's purely an intellectual, logical argument, and I don't know anyone who's ever come to really believe in God through it.
Right.
But logically, it works, I think.
Yeah.
I really love that, and it is a departure point probably for more conversation.
Sure, that's all it is.
Yeah.
I think much more existentially convincing is the moral argument.
Yeah,
that we
right,
were talking
right.
about earlier.
But so far what we've done is proved that the dollar is almighty and that Batman is God. No, that's not what
Everyone knows that a real dollar bill is greater than an imaginary.
That's true. That's exactly right.
Yeah, we touched on this a little bit about these arguments and reasons don't necessarily speak to the sovereignty of God or the authority of Scripture. Is that a similar case when we're talking about Jesus Christ and his role in our faith? Is there a similar need for a jump or a step of faith in that?
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a whole separate body of reasons for believing in Jesus Christ as the revelation of God and even as God incarnate. And the arguments for the existence of God don't lead there. So you have to switch to different arguments if you think it's even useful. And for some people it is. Some people say, I want to believe in Jesus Christ, but I just don't know if there's reason to believe in Jesus Christ. And first of all, I would say to them, well, have you actually asked him if he exists? And I say this to atheists too. When we get to the end of the argument on my blog and we're not able to come to agreement, I say, would you be willing to just ask God if he exists to reveal himself to you? And so far, not one has said they would be willing to do that.
No takers.
Which feels to me that they don't really want there to be a God. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with Jesus Christ. I think Jesus Christ is pressing in on us and wants us to believe in him, and has done more than enough to give us reason to believe in him. For example, one of your questions that we haven't touched on yet, but I'll bring it up, is the resurrection. If Jesus didn't stay dead, if he rose from the dead, and there's no other explanation for the church coming into existence because the disciples were absolutely dejected and disheartened and on the verge of fleeing for their lives after Jesus was buried, what suddenly changed? What turned them into a force that turned the world upside down? Well, it can only be that Jesus didn't stay dead. Now, there have been all kinds of alternative explanations, like he only fainted.
Yeah, right. The swoon theory or whatever.
Anyone who knows what a crucifixion was in the Roman Empire knows you're dead when you're dead. At the end of it, you are really, really dead.
They were good at that.
They were really good at that. They did it a lot, and they knew how to make sure it worked. So what else could possibly explain all of the disciples except John and most of the apostles dying for their preaching that Jesus was alive and not dead, unless they had seen him after his death alive? Now, people who don't want to believe really aren't going to be convinced by that, but people who want to believe can go, oh, I hadn't really thought of that before. Now, the second point is, if Jesus rose from the dead, it had to be God who raised him from the dead. And if God raised Jesus from the dead, then he had to have been confirming that Jesus' claims about himself were true, because he was executed as a blasphemer for making himself equal with God, because he went around forgiving sins as if he was the one sinned against, not like a priest who would say, God forgives your sins. Rather, he acted like he was the one people sinned against when they sinned, and he had the right to forgive their sins. And he said, the Father and I are one, and so forth. So at his trial, he was accused of blasphemy. And if he was raised from the dead, it had to have been God, and God had to have been saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. So I think a really good argument that's not as logically tight as the ontological argument, but as a historical argument, and no historical argument is logical in the same way the ontological argument is, so there's always room for a skeptic to say, no, I don't believe that could have happened.
And that's true across any area
Absolutely
of history,
anything.
though, correct?
Yes.
I mean, that's how history works.
So the only reason for rejecting the resurrection of Jesus really is a false notion that somehow miracles are unscientific, that you can't believe in science and in miracles, but that's really not true. Because from a Christian point of view anyway, miracles are simply God's suspension of his own natural laws, which he has the right to do.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a God, miracles are possible. If there isn't a God, then I don't think miracles are impossible, but they're not as likely and don't have any real explanation.
Right,
but if you're
right.
a believer in God, then I don't see why you would not believe in miracles. And it's not contrary to science, because science only studies the regularities in nature. It doesn't study the exceptions.
Yeah.
And it's no business of science to say whether miracles can happen or not.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point, and cannot be overemphasized.
No, I think that's helpful. I think we who have lived as Christians for a long time forget the weight or the consequence of
That's
those
right.
beliefs. And so when we ask questions like this, I think that's easy for us to overlook of, that they might not necessarily want to believe in God or in Christ because there's so much consequence and so much that results from that. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, it implies an awful lot if you say God does exist. You have said this many times. Since I have known you, Dr. Olson, you've talked about many times, and you've mentioned even tonight, about how you dialogue, or that you dialogue often with skeptics and atheists and so forth. How has such dialoguing changed you, and has it helped you hold people in high regard? And I guess what I'm asking there is it good beyond having a debate for us interpersonally to speak with people about such matters?
Oh, of course, I think it's important and helpful, but I don't think my answer is going to satisfy you, but I'm going to give it anyway. Those dialogues with atheists and agnostics have made me feel sorry for them.
Okay.
Because ultimately it showed me they have no hope for life after death. They have no hope that there is real meaning in life. And it grieves me. It breaks my heart.
Yeah, and I don't find that is, I really don't find that is a dissatisfactory answer, because what I hear from that is a deep well of compassion. You mentioned the word grieve. I mean, I
go out of my way to help them if they will allow me to on my blog. And sometimes they don't think my attempt to help them is helpful.
Right.
What I found out is that most of them have dug in their heels and determined that they are not going to believe in God, and nothing anyone says is going to change their mind. Mm-hmm. So I'm really talking more on my blog, for example, not to the confirmed atheists and agnostics, which there are plenty who come to my blog to argue with me, but more to the people who might be confused by them, people like them, into thinking that atheism is more intellectually respectable than belief in God, which it certainly is not.
That's so great to hear, and it's actually very encouraging to hear that people can come to a place like that and see that it is there is some robustness to faith, rather than just all the robustness belonging to disbelief. And I love that. Yeah. Love that.
That leads us well into this question. For those that don't believe in God, for less abstract or philosophical reasons, but rather, I can't, the idea that I can't believe in a God who would let my mother get sick, who would let my friend pass away, that allows suffering, and those things that are more emotional or emotional reasons like that, as opposed to the detached philosophical reasons. What would you say to them about belief in God and those things?
It's a great question.
Well, first of all, I would ask them who they think God is. Do they think that God is a micromanager of all events, that everything that happens is willed by God? And I would try to argue them away from that and say that is not the biblical picture of God. There are other beings in the universe who cause a lot of suffering and grief, and God allows that. We don't know exactly why God allows that, except C.S. Lewis said somewhere, I think in The Problem of Pain, that pain is the megaphone that God uses to arouse a deaf world to its need of him. So I would ask them to please read a book like The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, or Greg Boyd's book, Is God to Blame? Or any other number of popular books. I mean, there are very sophisticated academic books on this subject, but people won't read those for the most part.
Yeah.
So there are these really astute popularizers of the more academic arguments that I strongly recommend, and they're on YouTube. You can just look up Greg Boyd, and he's answering the question about God and suffering and so forth. I do not believe that God is a micromanaging deity who can be blamed for everything that happens in the universe. And so I think that a lot of people are just have a mistaken view of God, that if something terrible happens, it must be from God. Now, of course, I believe that God allows it, but I think to say that God would always step in and stop innocent suffering from happening or evil from happening would really be to take away free will. And our having free will depends on there being real risk and danger in the world.
Real risk. And you and I have talked about this before in this whole concept of free will. That's the kind of universe you get, isn't it? I mean, a universe with risks.
So then I ask people, if you believe there is no God because your mother died and mine died when I was a child, so I've been through that. If there is no God because your mother died, then do you think your mother's just dead and she's not anywhere? If there's God, then death is extinction. And do you believe that there's no hope for a better world to come? Because if there's no God, then there isn't. So I think a lot of people just haven't thought through all of that. But those who have often find God to be the source of comfort, like C.S. Lewis in his book, Surprised by Joy, and other books that he's written about the same subject. His wife died, and it plunged him into depression, and God was the only thing that held him up in that time of terrible loss and depression.
I love that, what you said. And am I remembering this correctly, just from a few seconds ago, talking about this hypothetical death of a mother with someone? Do you believe that your mother just went extinct? Is that what you said?
That's the question I would ask.
I have never heard it phrased like that. And
yeah, because if there's no God, then your mother's not only dead, she's extinct. You're never going to see her again.
Yes. And so really it is if that is then not the case, if a person, say, is a believer or has some kind of even tenuous faith, to say, well, I believe that something of her must go on, then you can say it's really about the grief that you feel, and we can talk about that. I guess.
Well, this is another confusion about God that permeates our society, is that God is there to comfort us and make us feel good. And nowhere indicates that God is especially concerned with our life in this world and whether it's comfortable or not.
Yeah.
So that's just something the church has failed at, I think, and popular Christianity and the enemies of Christianity have all kind of agreed that God, if he exists, is the all-determining reality and should be the one who gives us comfort and makes our lives comfortable and affluent and prosperous and all of those things. But the Bible never indicates that.
That's right.
We live toward another life. There's another world that matters more than this one. And so I will die, but that's not a big deal. As one Southern gospel singer sang it on a Bill Gaither video, death ain't no big deal.
You could start another blog with that name, Dr. Olson. Well, a pluralistic society. Can we just talk about that for just a second? We've got a pluralistic society. How do we promote and keep dialogue going in a world that is increasingly, sometimes it seems, afraid to have a real conversation?
Well, yeah, that's a very challenging one because our culture is so against making truth claims, unless they're
Yeah.
truth claims against belief. And so for some
Which is
reason,
just
atheists can get
maddening.
respect for arguing vehemently and wrongly against belief in God. But if I stand up and say, no, that's wrong, actually, God does exist, you're wrong, then that's not respectable to do.
Yeah.
But I think we have to do it anyway. And I think we can do it in a way that's respectful of person's integrity and not insulting them. But I still think that we can do it. And that's part of the church's mission, as we're
Yes.
doing this evening, is to talk to people of different faiths, people who maybe don't share our faith in God and so forth, about the reasons for it and why it's reasonable and existentially fulfilling. But we have so many Christians today who are being a distraction, and the media loves, just absolutely loves to pick up on those people. Christian celebrities who fall. And our answer should be, of course, that's just being human. We're all fallible. We all make mistakes. We all sin. What's the big deal exactly? Nobody claims that Christian celebrities or any other Christian is perfect. That's not a count against what we believe. It's actually confirmation of what we do believe, that we're all sinners.
That's right. Yeah. Love that.
That's incredibly helpful, and I know we're running out of time here, but Dr. Olson, thank you for joining us. As we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or suggestions for people that might be listening to this that are wrestling with these questions of, does God exist? And whether that's coming from an emotional or a philosophical place. Do you have any final thoughts or suggestions for them?
Yeah, I think that it would be well worth their time to turn off the TV and social media and go to YouTube. Thank God for YouTube. Unfortunately, I have commercials now, and look at the YouTube talks by John Lennox. He has so many of them, and he is just so, he's such a joyful person and a Cambridge University philosopher and mathematician, and he is just so articulate. I think he's a gift to us in this regard, and they're short, they're succinct, they're concise, they're not confusing. So John Lennox, people like Ard Louis, who also teaches at Cambridge, a physicist. That's Louis. A-R-D is his first name, Louis, but it's pronounced Louis. People like Alistair McGrath. I know I'm naming a bunch of Brits. I wish there were more Americans who were as articulate about all this as these guys are.
Indeed, yeah.
They're the new theists, I call them, and I blogged about them. And they're all over YouTube, and they're just excellent. And but I have to mention them because it's really hard to sift through all the garbage on YouTube to get to these people. So that's why I'm naming them. I think you have to know their names to go find them on YouTube and listen to them.
Very
and
helpful.
Influenced by them.
Very practical. And thank you for helping us approach a faith that has some solid ground to it, as true faith actually does. And you've reminded us of that, Dr. Olson.
Well, there's no better calling or task for me than this. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
You bet. Absolutely. And I hope that you will continue to have these kinds of dialogues with folks, even though many are staunch in their atheism. There, as you said, there are folks who are confused, who are looking for some solid ground. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Good night. Good night, everybody. We hope that you will now jump on over to Zoom, where Megan and Dr. Olson will be there for Q&A. It's going to be a good time of exchange of ideas. Thanks, everybody.
The link will be in the Facebook page, so join us on Zoom right now.